Welcome to the Helix Center. I'm Ed Nersessian, the director of the center. In 1932, July of 1932, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Freud asking him about, to quote him, "Is there any way of delivering mankind from the menace of war?" And Freud then wrote a pretty long paper answering that question. I say that because our next roundtable on January 11th will be on why war. It will be multidisciplinary, so we will have neuroscientists, psychoanalysts, sociologists, anthropologists participating at that roundtable. Today's roundtable is on otherness, and it was organized by Dr. Daniel Posner, and he will introduce the participants and then proceed. Thank you. Huh?
I have the honor of introducing them.
Oh, you are introducing.
Yes.
You
Okay.
changed your mind.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Jerry Hurwitz. I'm an associate director at Helix, and I do have the honor of announcing the members of this prestigious board. They're going to discuss otherness. So if you would raise your hand when I mention your name, please. First, Jessica Benjamin is best known as the author of The Bonds of Love from 1988, which brought a feminist intersubjective perspective into the psychoanalytic field, and of Beyond Doer and Done To, an intersubjective view of thirdness, which that's 2004, and that became the basis for her more recent book, Beyond Doer and Done To, Recognition Theory, Intersubjectivity, and a Third from 2018. This book emphasizes the importance of acknowledgement in therapeutic interaction and in relation to trauma, including collective historical trauma. In addition, she is the author of Like Subjects, Love Objects, and The Shadow of the Other. She has been one of the leaders in the relational movement in psychoanalysis since its inception. She teaches and supervises at the New York University postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, as well as the Stephen Mitchell Relational Studies Center, of which she is a co-founder. Janice Edwards is a clinical social worker, thank you. She received her MSW from Howard University School of Social Work and her PhD from the National Catholic School of Social Work, Catholic University, Doctorate School of Social Work since 2011. She was the principal investigator of a Health Resource Services Administration $1 million grant training social work students in behavioral health and substance use disorders. Dr. Edwards maintains a private practice providing psychodynamic and psychoanalytic-oriented treatment. Her experience spans inpatient and outpatient psychotherapy for children, adolescents, and adults. Prior to academia, she was clinical director of the Emergency Psychiatric Response Team at the FBI for 10 years, addressing crises and trauma treatment. She also served as a policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Dr. Edwards has consulted with numerous agencies and has served on the boards of the Washington School of Psychiatry and the Montgomery County Mental Health Association. As an accomplished author, she is president of the American Association for Psychoanalysis and Clinical Social Work and serves on the editorial board of Clinical Social Work Journal and Psychoanalytic Social Work Journal. Daniel Golden serves as editor of Psychoanalytic Inquiry. He is a training and supervising analyst on the faculty of the Institution of Contemporary Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles and has written numerous articles for psychoanalytic dialogues, psychoanalysis, self and context, and psychoanalytic inquiry. His book, Storytelling and Psychoanalysis and in the Everyday World, will be published by Routledge this year. Daniel Golden, with Daniel Posner, one of our other panelists, create and host the popular psychoanalytic podcast, The Conversation. Historian, psychoanalyst, and psychiatrist George McCarry is the director of the DeWitt Wallace Institute of Psychiatry, History, Policy, and the Arts, and a professor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. For over 2 decades, he has worked to integrate humanistic scholarship into mind, brain, medicine, and science. His latest book, Of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia, 2021, was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and a Bloomberg Book of the Year. His previous award-winning works include Soul Machine, The Invention of the Modern Mind from 2015, and Revolution in Mind, The Creation of Psychoanalysis from 2008. Translated into 11 languages, his books have inspired 8 symposia. His essays have appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Raritan, and the New York Times, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Daniel Posner is assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where he teaches and supervises psychiatry residents in psychodynamic therapy. His writing explores a range of topics through a multiple lens of psychoanalysis, enactive phenomenology, which you may all recall we touched on a panel or two ago, epistemic justice, and infancy research. He has published work in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, Psychoanalysis, Self and Context, and Psychoanalytic Inquiry, where he is an associate director. As noted, he co-leads the podcast, The Conversation, with Daniel Golden. Eyal Rosmarin is a psychoanalyst and writer. His research takes place at the intersection of psychoanalysis and social theory and explores the relations between the subjective and collective aspects of human life. He has written about how psychosocial constellations such as gender, sexuality, ethnicity, ideology, nationality, and history form our sense of self, our identifications, and attachments. He has been interested in belonging as a fundamental psychosocial drive. He is co-editor of the book series Relational Perspectives in Psychoanalysis and on the editorial board of Psychoanalytic Dialogues. Eyal teaches at the White Institute and the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. Originally from Israel, Palestine, he now lives and works in New York. His upcoming book is titled Belonging and Its Discontents. Jasper St. Bernard is a visiting assistant professor of history at Rhodes College. His academic work currently focuses on African American philosophy, focusing primarily on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His recently completed dissertation explored the anti-lynching work of Ida B. Wells Barnett, while Jasper's work focuses on the social political thought of Black people during the lynching era. The topics he has written on have varied. For instance, in the Rutledge Handbook of Philosophy and Implicit Cognition from 2022, he co-wrote a chapter with Dr. Sean Gallagher, Race and the Implicit Aspects of Embodied Interaction, we touched on recently, along with enactive cognition. Where in that paper, Race and the Implicit Aspects of Embodied Social Interaction, they explored the role the body and early childhood have in the development of one's implicit biases. He also co-wrote an article with Dr. Verena Erlenbusch Anderson, Just the Same as Fascism for Us, the Black Panther Party's Anti-Fascist Thought and Praxis from 2023, in which they examined the party's formulation of fascism and how that relates to discussions regarding the relationship between America and fascism that grew around 2015-2016. Jasper most recently joined a group of international thinkers and practitioners in a book project, Ubuntu, Interdisciplinary Conversations Across Continents from 2023. And with that long list of accomplishments, we'll take it away, panel.
Start. This is an interesting opportunity because we've already talked amongst each other, but in a different format. But being together and doing this in a roundtable, I think will be both relevant to the topic, and it'll be easy to get going because we already have a sense of where we were. There's obviously a political moment right now that's charged. I guess I want to make just a meta note that we're probably not going to want to get into discussions of takes on elections and this kind of stuff. Now we're going to stick with the topic of otherness and hear from people's particular perspective and expertise. I think, as in the podcast, it might be worth remembering, perhaps at the top, that the notion of an other, before we problematize it and turn it into something that can be used against, is actually constitutive of our sense of being persons, of having subjectivity at all. You wouldn't really know that there was a reality at all if you didn't have a sense that it was something out there that could be experienced by people just like you. So I think that is a foundation that we can start from, and we will look at developmental aspects of how the more problematic kinds of othering emerge, and we're going to look at aspects of cultural permeation and how they contribute early in development to patterns in families and cultures of using othering as a strategy. And we're going to hear about something I think that also touches on this moment, which is we're in a moment of frightening true xenophobia, a kind of crisis. And we have an expert to help us sort of sort out what's unique about that in terms of otherness and othering. With that, kind of want whoever feels like it to just pick it up. Or I could tell them. I think there's yeah, oh, go ahead. I'm calling on Jessica.
What?
Did you?
Okay.
You said something.
No, I just said you should call on people.
Okay.
You should, in other words, maybe you'd structure it.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
It's a spontaneous conversation.
Yeah, okay.
No, just to start.
Yeah.
Just,
Well, let me.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Okay.
I'll just bring up something that's sort of autobiographical, just to kind of be a little vulnerable here, I suppose. I think my first introduction to this sort of idea of otherness came from my very, very early childhood. I'm an identical twin. And that's a very, very strange phenomenon, right? Because I have a brother who I'm very close to, especially when I was little. And there was a sense that we could have almost a spiritual connection with one another. We knew each other's minds really well. There was a sense of recognition between the two of us, probably more between the two of us than from our parents in many ways. At the same time, when we went out into the world, suddenly we would collapse into this rather extreme category of twinness. And people would react to us in this way of, oh my God, you two are the same. What's it like? Do you have your same language? Oh, there's two of you, right? And suddenly all that sort of sense of selfness that we developed with one another just would collapse. And so I was very early on sort of brought into this idea of the difference between one's identity in the world as a category and how one is.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, that was something I've been thinking about. I wrote a paper on it.
Yeah.
And then in 2016, when Trump got elected, the otherness seemed to be, I see Trump's fascism, I think, as its nation building around othering. So it sort of, yeah.
Did you and your brother vote on different sides?
No, we were the same side. Yeah, Janice.
Well, let's go back to the Declaration of Independence, because there we see the beginning of othering. When they come out with, we the people, we hold these truths to be self-evident, but yet the darker reality is that our country is brutally and blatantly split between whiteness and darkness. Whiteness is the dominant society, so anybody that's outside of the dominant society is automatically the other. And so we African Americans, we're other. And we became the containment from the time we were brought over here for disavowed hate, envy, and prohibited sexual fantasies. And this was well before Klein, when Melanie was talking about projective identification, etc., and the language of splitting. So we have been othered on a slave ship, and we continue to be treated as the other. And because of who we are, I think it undergirds, not to get into politics, the decisions that we have seen recently in our election.
This is so interesting because in a way, the problem of the overuse of the word other, and it dilutes its meaning. But we just heard two very different discourses about the same term. And the question is, like, what is the link between the phenomenology of otherness, the ontology of otherness, like it is constitutive, as you say, of subjectivity. It is embedded in the other mind problem. I do not know what's going on in your head. And yet it has this downstream effect of being incredibly important politically and in terms of power. So that the struggle to bridge all that is, I think, incumbent on anyone who really wants to think hard about the problem.
So my response to that is then to take the next step, which is to look at the contradiction between the two ways we use the other. On the one side, and when I was first writing about this, I was using the term other all the time, but I was using it to talk about the dilemma of having to recognize the other, because you can't really have any subjectivity unless you're capable of recognizing the other. But then, of course, as you say, splitting comes along and you figure out, oh, I can be a subject by recognizing this other who is, let's say, like me, and denying recognition to the other who's not like me. And now that other that's not like me becomes the other in a different way, like the bad other and the good other, I guess you could say. And so we're always like using the term to mean two radically different things. The other I do recognize and the other I deny recognition to. And I think that where we do have to look at maybe where the two actually meet, which is that the other that I do recognize, I recognize with great difficulty. I recognize with pain. I recognize with a certain kind of sacrifice, of omnipotence, in Freudian terms, or as I would put it, the realization that there is an other will that does not want the same thing as I want. She doesn't want me to use this beautiful red crayon on the wall. And now this person that I, go to for all my soothing and care suddenly is mad at me or sees things very differently than I do. That formative experience of difference is then dependent on how that other reacts when you crayon on the wall, and so forth. So that problem of how we actually become able to recognize an other, not in a forced way that undermines itself, right? That really is then such just in the power struggle, and then real recognition. So from my point of view, it's that non-differentiating forced power struggle realization about the other that then turns into the hatred of whatever other we're going to pick on, but in particular, obviously, in America.
Can I make the philosophical move and I just have a question about how a specific word is being tossed around, just so I can track. So this idea of recognition, this idea of recognition and what we mean, what we take ourselves to mean when we say recognition, because even in that example that was being given, I don't know that, sometimes it is framed as if I am recognizing this other, but I'm not recognizing this other. But there's something in that relationship that seems to at least edge toward recognition. It's a different kind of recognition. And the reason I ask that is because one of the things that I find interesting, doing social political philosophy, specifically here in America, is that there seems to be like a preemptive moralizing, that like the individual knows that it is bad to misrecognize, which is why we build in excuses for the misrecognition. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, but then we obfuscate that when we say, oh, I'm recognizing this one and not, I think you already have recognized this other. It's just there's a certain relationship that is demanded of that kind of recognition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe because I'm hearing something around the distinction between mutual recognition and alienated recognition and the role of dissociation that it kicks in. Because I think where the hope is in certain familial or developmental styles, there's mutual recognition and a tendency not to have to dissociate the things that you get ashamed about or that you screw up in the course of everyday life. The family sort of says, we're all flawed and we're all in this together. And then you don't have to dissociate, you don't have to build up a kind of sense that whatever's shameful about what I did is going to have to end up, hopefully, either working and making me belong to this tough family that shamed me, and I'll project that later and we can get to some of that stuff. Or, I don't have to dissociate so much. I can actually live in a lawful kind of world where I take responsibility for what I'm prone to want to dissociate myself from when I see something that is not like me. It's sort of how I, see the
But
dilemma
you
there.
could put it more simply, just to say in a way that granting your point, Jasper, that the idea is that initially, of course, in terms of social recognition, children don't have social recognition when they're 2 years old and first struggling to recognize any other, person as having this other mind and possible power over them. So what develops in a way, in one kind of psychoanalytic way of thinking, is this splitting where, in effect, the bad other is, the receptacle, the one that you project everything into, for instance, everything that you're not allowed to be. But then how does that mesh with this idea that you're still recognizing them? In other words, you're saying, I think rightly, that when you deny recognition to somebody, you've already recognized them, and then you're categorizing them as, what I look at it as sort of like the discarded and the dignified. You're categorizing them as, the one that is not dignified, but really you've already recognized them.
Well, maybe we need to add a layer to all of this, is that othering is also how collectives organize themselves, groups of people organize themselves. This is us, and this is you.
Them.
And so part of what goes on is that beyond how we develop to recognize each other as individuals, we are interpolated into groups that tell us this is who we are and this is not, and that becomes, I think, as essential part of our psychology and of our subjectivity as whatever encounters we have in the family and growing up. So if you think about that, then we have a whole other...
I want to bring...
I was going to ask Jasper actually to talk a little bit about that very
I was going
idea.
to actually bring in George's work.
Go. Do it.
Because I think that this question of the two others, the one that's fully recognized and the one that's semi-recognized, is really fits with your notion of the xenos and the barbaros that you wrote about in your book.
Right. So that goes back to antiquity and this misuse of the word xenos and xenophobia, because actually that meant other city-states in Greece, and that's why, as a 19th century term, when it came along, it really was about barbarians in antiquity. But I was going to take it a slightly different direction, because I think this is... I think if you take the philosophy seriously, we are always othering people. It is constitutive of subjectivity. And if you start with that, you're not like so much on your high horse. And you're also not so shamed about doing it. It's necessary. And there's also kind of very clear ways that humans have figured out over time, and this is pre-psychoanalytic theory, right? Conversation. You figure out what's going on in the other person's head. They become a subject. Now there's a kind of third space in between where your subjectivity is shared. That's, I think, thousands of years old. And one of the reasons it's important to say that is because when we immediately pathologize this, it also means that we can't really think about it clearly. It's shameful. We can't think about the fact that communities do organize themselves like that. And that's not the problem. There's second-order effects of how rigid are those communities. What kind of community is that you have to delve into, not that there's some kumbaya world where there's no us and them. And so that's really what I tried to kind of develop and say, other anxiety is constitutive of human interaction. There are common ways of getting around it. Even if you've got a misperception, like, a lot of the sociologists who did research on racism and anti-immigrant sentiment would find someone who said, like, a Chinese man chased me through the woods. I thought he was going to kill me. Ever since then, I've hated all the Chinese. And kind of like, we know what to do about that too. If it's a misassociation, that's the problem of integration. That's when you bring that person together with that one association into a school where there are a lot of Chinese people and they play with them and they date with them, and that's called habituation. That works also for a percentage of people. A bunch of us here are psychoanalysts. We actually have helped articulate the harder problem, which is when there is projection, the need to hate, the desire to hate, not the mistake of hating. And that's where, psychoanalysts have really done great work in trying to help us think about this complicated othering that then takes on such monstrous historical kind of proportions.
Can I just object to one thing you said right at the beginning?
You can object to a number of them.
You said that we're always othering. I think you're conflating differentiation and othering in your example where you then say, I have to figure out what's in your mind and I'm going to converse with you. I'm not othering you when I'm doing that. I understand that you are an other, and that's differentiation. Othering really is a negative term, and I think we have to keep it as a negative, because otherwise we don't distinguish between the aggressive act of expelling someone from our us and
I don't think Sartre would agree with you.
and differentiating other minds, which is very different.
Well, that's
process.
a very specific definition, perhaps it's yours, but Sartre wouldn't agree with you, and of course all the French
Sartre didn't connect to anybody, so the question of what he saw as differentiation is a whole other problem.
He's the font of the theory of the other. It's a French development that happens with Sartre at the head of the tape.
The other, that's the problem. That's the French other, and then there's the Hegelian other.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. I do think it sounds like...
The issue is, when we talk about there's differentiation and othering, and I'm speaking about othering from my cultural context, and that is that we were assigned othering, okay? And in our work, I think we fail to understand the context of the other. How do we explore it?
Yeah.
How do we unveil and really open up the othering between you and myself, the client, the dyad, and the therapeutic experience?
I just had a question, though, that relates to Jasper, because you have that very interesting paper on cultural permeation and how it produces embodied learning, in a sense, to become racist, essentially. And that, to some degree, that offers, I think, it's a dark view, because in some ways it feels like, oh boy, if it's not just something we're learning, we're picking up in every motion, every movement, every tone of voice, and every way that who is different and valencing it for us, that's a problem. But there is a sense, I thought you were talking a little bit, I thought last night we were talking about that toward the end of your paper about Fanon, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about it. But there's also a sense that, like, maybe cultural permeation is a way out, back into a picture of what belonging would look like, if it's the only way in some ways.
Yeah, so that, and I'm going to piggyback on something you were pointing to. So I kind of wandered the streets today, and I was listening to different people, their readings on Black Skin, White Mass. It's something that which is a book by Fanon, that the paper that was mentioned that I wrote is largely about that 5th chapter. But you just helped me understand something. So in that chapter and in the introduction, Fanon talks about how the black man in that French colonial context has no ontological resistance to the white man.
Yeah.
So it's the dishonoring as an other subject that is at the root of, or is one of the roots of, like, that misalignment that happens in interaction. Which is, and when you said, like, that's thrust upon, like, that lack of ontological resistance is really interesting to me. Like, he is a subject. He knows that he's a subject, but that subjecthood is not offered to him in the interaction.
Right.
So, like, he's understood to be an object, which is really interesting. But to speak to one of the things we pointed to in the paper, one of the things we tried to explore because I'm not a psychoanalyst, I'm a philosopher, but one of the things we tried to figure out was, so in the 5th chapter, Fanon is narrativizing this scene on the train. And it's debated whether it's a narrative, whether it's him, and that we don't have to do that right now. But he's the narrator is a black man who's on the train. He's cold. It's winter time. He's shivering. A young white boy points to him and directs the young boy's mother's attention to him and says, "Mom, look, a Negro." And then all this unfolds in the mind of the narrator about what that means. And so what we were trying to do is chase how a kid could know that early
Right.
that mom look, right?
Right.
And you know, one of the reasons I'm drawn to that chapter is I remember I was called I'm trying to figure out, I was called a nigger by a little 5-year-old white boy in Wisconsin, blonde hair. He pointed, and I took something. I knew his parents. I took something from him that was going to harm him, and he yelled that out in frustration. How does a kid know that I'm that already, right? That's the question. And so toward the end of the paper, and I'm going to cut after this, but through some studies, it suggested that child is learning through the parents who to be afraid of, how to respond. If the child is on an elevator with mom or dad, and a black person enters the elevator and the parent cinches up, that child realizes, like, oh, wait a second, I'm in, like, they sense the threat that the parent senses. And so all of what Fanon calls the historical, racial,
Cultural
schema. Like, we have one in America, and that is bestowed or bequeathed to children quite early. And even if they may not know who the other is at 2, but as soon as they know who the other is, they know who the other is. Because they learn quite early who the other is.
Yeah.
And that's why Du Bois said that we have to function with double consciousness to protect as a defense mechanism from the other that can hurt us.
From that look, the Sartrean look that Fanon, I think, is capturing.
You know, I have a Don.
I was just going to add one more thing. So you said that the thing that psychoanalysts have done a good job of doing is getting to the why of like one, or the need, the necessity for this other.
Right.
Sometimes, and what's in, now that I'm thinking about this paper that we wrote, I think that is the one thing the parents often don't explicitly share with the child. So the child learns who the other is, but doesn't know the necessity of it yet.
I have a slightly different thought about the psychoanalytic necessity of this, and maybe it's not really a psychoanalytic idea, because I think all of our psychoanalytic ideas about how that happens have to do with sort of a deficit model of early childhood. We have parents that shamed us, didn't recognize us, so we need to sort of get rid of that shame onto the other person. But I think there's something more that comes from the culture.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a mythos, a mythology. It's a positive thing, right? And so that and we can look at this in terms of child development, right? So we tend to look at child development primary intersubjectivity way. But Trevarthen and some others have talked about secondary intersubjectivity, which is when the child and the mother jointly attend to objects in the world. So the world then becomes something that they learn about together, but it also becomes humanized. It's part of their relationship. And there was a famous study by MD where they had a mother look at an object with disgust. A day later, the child reacted to that object, which was a neutral object, with disgust.
Yep.
Now, wait. This goes, the next step in child development is joint reminiscence, where the mother and the child tell stories together. And one thing that's a robust finding is that children remember their previous day's experiences the most when they are taking their mother's experience that she added to the equation. So there's a way in which these narratives, this mythos, this white supremacist mythos among white people that we aren't even really fully aware of, it's unconscious. It's a storyline and a narrative that seeps into our bodies.
Right. We're already acting it out all the time is sort of the implication of your paper.
I am contending with this more and more as I'm growing aware of this, is that this is in me, and to some degree. It's in my sinews and my blood.
One thing I would just, before I just respond, I think that's helpful. I also think that if we think about it in a circular sense, right, that culture goes back to family, goes back to culture. They're not really in opposition. Yes. And I think that you can see that, George Lakoff has that idea of the strict father morality culture. I don't want to get too much into politics, but these are very hierarchical kinds of family cultures that use, we think, alienated recognition, shaming as a kind of way of saying you only learn things because you've been taught that you're bad and that was bad. And bullying is not necessarily discouraged. It might be a way of actually saying this is how I belong to this particular culture. When I see a bully, I'm in the right place. I should be doing that. And that's so reinforced circularly, through the culture and its creation and its productions back into the family and its style of parenting.
But Ferenczi kind of gets into that when he talks about the development of the sense of reality. And so then it becomes embedded intrapsychically.
And Fanon pushes, in his book, he pushes away from the individual to what he calls the sociogenic. And so I think even any attempt to make sense of this through a sort of individualized mind is a mistake, in my opinion. I don't think we'll capture it, because even if you were to disabuse the singular mind of these notions culturally, we're so enmeshed in them culturally that one individual mind being liberated does not solve or
that was the section of the book that I found the most compelling. Because what Fanon was basically saying was he was raised as though white. He didn't realize that there was something wrong with him until he entered the white culture, until he went to France.
Yeah.
And all of our theories focus on either, we have this idea of mental illness, right? If the onus is on the individual, or it's on the family, we were raised a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. But Fanon realizes that it's about his fittedness in the world. That was what was wrong. And so the world is as much a subject of critique as the individual, and it's essential that we be able to do that as psychoanalysts.
Yeah, but the individual and collective processes are not necessarily always different. The reason to understand the individual process, for instance, what you just described in the research of how disgust is communicated, you have to do that you can't just talk about some generality. If you're going to look at people, you're looking at how individual psyches function, and then you're trying to see how that interacts with or maybe is parallel to the collective. And if you don't, otherwise you get rid of psychoanalysis altogether, which might be okay for you, but not for me.
I just think we need to reconceptualize.
Yeah, but wait 1 second. So I want to point out that Fanon was a psychoanalyst, and I want to point out that Fanon did understand collective processes through his psychoanalytic understanding. And when he, for instance, is talking in that book about how the black bourgeoisie is trying to mimic whiteness, or and put on the white mask and so forth, he's talking about something you can also identify in an individual. For instance, you can actually watch an individual try to avoid shame by talking in a certain way or doing something where they're conforming to the outer culture, which, by the way, is also true around things like bullying and being aggressive. Men, that is to say boys, have to mimic a certain kind of aggression in order to belong. Yeah. So and then you still have the very interesting question of which boys really, shall we say, have absorbed that within themselves through their various relational experiences versus those who are just conforming to what everybody in school is doing. There's a big difference. And usually the kid that becomes the bully is the one that got it in their family as well. You really can see that difference. So when you consider what we're talking about, we're still saying that there can be a tension within people between those who, in a sense, are fully organized around and committed to othering, and those for whom that's a conflict or potentially conflict, which I think is really politically important.
But maybe the psychoanalytic question to what Daniel said is everything mediated through personal experience and the family, or there is some kind of social, cultural thing that hovers,
That's what I just said
and
about
we pick
schools,
from
yeah, for instance.
directly. For
Yeah,
example, I come from a country that Ta-Nehisi Coates just called the most racist country in the world.
I can't hear.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
I just said, I come from a country that Ta-Nehisi Coates just called the most racist country in the world, and I tend to agree with him, which is Israel. But we did not have black people racism in Israel, because there's no black people, mostly, or the ones that have been brought to Israel are Jews from Ethiopia. And so the whole history is different. There is another kind of racism. It's a racism against Arabs, against Palestinians specifically. But when I came to the United States, which is many years ago now, I realized that I'm struggling with racism in the American version too. And I don't know how I got it. Because I don't know how I got it. But I think it came to me.
Welcome aboard.
It came to me from I think there's two things. One, to go to George's point. I think collectivists are organized by othering, or even more, as René Girard said, by scapegoating. So you create a line, we are here, you're there. And there's always a function of you're there. And you're different, and maybe you're less, or you're my enemy, or something like this. So I grow up like this, and in my version, it's the Arabs, okay? But I come here, and that category is less prominent, but I think somewhere is sort of ontologically, I'm looking for another category, and that's what lands, because that's what's in the air here.
In other words, you're putting blacks in the place of Arabs to some degree in your psyche?
I realize that it goes into the same place somehow. So I'm saying it's not even, no mother held my hand in the elevator, but it somehow is in the air.
Can I, so there's, this was this extraordinary research that occurred. Some of it went into the authoritarian personality by Adorno. They wanted to understand anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. They went out and they did tons and tons of research, and they had scales for anti-Semitism, and it correlated very nicely with ethno-nationalism, like we're pure, the Jews are bad. Okay, but then they started to get inklings that these people who hated the Jews might hate some other people too. So they widened the scope. And it turns out the people who hate the Jews are very happy hating blacks. They're very happy at that time hating Turks, hating Mexicans. And so it made them completely reorient their project. Now, it couldn't be a project just about anti-Semitism, because that was a variable, not the constant. The constant they called the authoritarian personality. But I really like the term xenophobia, because it reverses the lens from us talking about the maligned group to what's going on in the people who do this. Right? All these words that we have, they're so important because they tell us who needs to be protected. Yeah. You know, Islamophobia, homophobia, anti-black racism, add to the list, right? They all name the group that's being othered. They do not reverse the lens, and xenophobia does. It says, wait a minute, these people might actually be comfortable hating a lot of people, and we have to understand what's going on with them. Just a second point I wanted to make really quickly, and I don't have that much to say about it, but there is an amazing archive at the institute that I run. It's from the folks who were sent over after 1945 in what was called the Denazification Project. The Denazification Project, this was David Levy and a bunch of other people, had to figure out who was in the community of Nazis and unredeemable, who was semi-redeemable, who was like a quarter redeemable, and who was just like going along because they needed the job. Because that's what we didn't do in Iraq, right? That's what we didn't do in Iraq. And so they wanted to try to not simply, you know, fire the whole German people, which wasn't really. And so they had to try to come up with questions about what you're wrestling with. How much did the culture create, and how much was internally motivated in people who marched along with the Nazis? And it's still a really tough question, because to Jessica's point, it's really hard to infer from individual to collective. We have to do it. It's politically very important. But if you give me something that's really solid, I'm going to be surprised, because I don't know anything that's really solid. It's a huge inference. We don't know how to think of a denominator of collectives. We have a lot of theories. Sartre had a theory, but there is a lot of difficulty we have. Group psychology has a theory. There's Beyond. There's other people like that. It's still really hard to do, I would argue.
Sorry.
No. I was struggling with Hegel's phenomenology.
Oh, yeah.
And, when he talks about the spirit, and I'm kind of thinking now about how he sees the other from the view of exploitation as a resource. So when you were talking about, from your perspective, I'm thinking, oh, okay, maybe this gives some meaning to what we're seeing right now. And I don't know how we get away from that, because exploitation seems to undergird all this.
You're making an incredibly important point, and this happened with Sartre. He had this theory of othering, and Beauvoir really came along and said, there's no history in your theory, and that means there's no power. There's no sense of history. And so they changed, and he wrote this great book about the position of the Jews in France. But that's such a big problem. How do you integrate power and history in a way that helps us understand, in a richer way, the value of having another, right? Because the way I think about it is there's this thing that happens all the time, and I think of it as ontological. And if you're relatively loose in terms of your own capacities to communicate with others, it moves back and forth. It's not locked in the way Fanon felt it was locked in. Then there are these very, very toxic situations, very destructive situations that have led to genocides where it locks in. And how does that happen? What's the key element? And we can go back to family, and that's what some people do, and the authoritarian personality goes back to family. But is it also culture? And then, we need philosophers and we need political theorists to help us.
Adorno didn't only believe in the family. Remember that he believed that capitalism was also a salient force.
That's the other of this conversation so far, in a way, is political economy.
No, that's what Janice is just bringing up, the issue of exploitation, the issue of capitalism,
I think
right?
that's just right
There's
on.
somebody who did try to integrate the individual and the social, I think, in an interesting way, and that's Pierre Bourdieu, who was a contemporary of Fanon's, I believe. And he also spent a lot of time in Algeria. And he had this concept of the habitus and the field. I'm sure you some of you know about this. The basic idea of habitus is it's like a series of habits, right? But it connects always to a field, and it can be an academic field, a family field, or the political field. And there are those who are brought into those fields in a very sort of natural way. They're educated into them. And their set of habits, of dispositions in the world match perfectly with the structures of society. That would be white people in America, right? And then there are those whose habitus don't match. They don't have access to that kind of education. They're brought up in different worlds. And there's this, what he refers to as symbolic violence.
But you notice that you introduced Bourdieu just at the moment where I said the word capitalism, picking up on what Janice said, talking about exploitation, you move over to somebody who is deliberately, Bourdieu, trying to find another social theory where he can get away from that painful issue of exploitation.
Well, he talks about exploitation.
Yeah, but
How does he talk about it, though?
But not in terms
He doesn't talk about
But it seemed like you were maybe wanting to introduce it,
Yeah.
this idea that there's, in the background of all of this, some
slavery was an
system, right? It's an economic system to some degree that can be seen as the super ordinate aspect of what drives people to commit. You were saying that even last night. Why would people commit to an identity? What do they get for it? Well, some sense that they might rise up in this capitalist system.
So the question I would ask, like, it may be difficult to infer from the individual to the culture, but I think the question that I would rather ask is turn the inference the other direction, and see these individuals as symptoms of a culture. So something you said made me think of, James Baldwin is talking about when he was growing up, he would watch the cowboy movies and, he'd root for a certain figure,
Yep.
and then as he got older, he realized like, oh wait, I'm the other right, like, I'm not him, I'm the other right. So like, but I think about all the other little boys who want like, it's just embedded in our culture to see the relation a certain way and exploitation at the root. I just wonder sometimes, or the suspicion, paranoia, I don't know, that I have is like, I don't know that we have the courage to admit certain core values about our culture. So when they pop up in an individual, we treat them as some sort of aberration, and they may not be an aberration at all. They may be a symptom and that's centuries long. That's trying to tell us something about how plagued our culture is when it comes to the other.
That's called
Yes.
healthy paranoia.
Yeah, but the thing is that also, even, there's no reason really to only go from one direction. You can keep going back and forth between the directions, I think, and as you tack back and forth, you get a richer picture, but you don't have to exclude anything. The thing about going from the cultural direction, I think, is still that what is most denied in many ways in our society, in America, is the fact of exploitation. Racism is understood in many ways as if it were inequality. So it's not just inequality. Exploitation is not simply inequality. Exploitation is where the inequality is produced because somebody is taking something away from somebody else. Power, as you say. So power, the history of power, the history of people taking something away from other people seems to go all the way back. But it changes at a certain point, right? And it changed in the modern era in terms of colonial power, and it changed, therefore, the nature of slavery, and slavery had existed before. So now we have this other kind of slavery. And the thing is that the powers that, shall we say, ruled our society really didn't want to give up slavery when slavery ended. Not just those who had been enslavers, but also those in the North who decided to support them because they really didn't want their wage slaves to be doing any better than they were, and Reconstruction threatened that. So we know we have that history whereby Reconstruction was suppressed by people in the North supporting the Southerners who reintroduced, the enslavement, without the literal bondage. So given all of that, our problem, I think, is that something is also denied, not only the dignity of the other, not only the equality of the other. What's denied is in the self. And see, I don't think there's any problem I don't think you need the word xenophobia because you got the word racism. But the word racism is, it's a general word, but the problem is when racism is divorced from its particular historical roots here, which have everything to do with exploitation and economic power. And that's a way to disenfranchise people, and as we know, to split people up so that they can't revolt together. And so I think that there's this really big issue around what is denied is in the self. What isn't acknowledged is the exploitative self, the predatory self. If we're going to talk about, the self and others, if the self were the white, what's denied is that predation, that exploitation, and that having power in the entire society. It's not only I want to exploit, these few workers and get wealth. I want to make sure that I protect my wealth by exploiting everybody.
And I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay,
I just want, just to be clear, what I'm denying then in the self psychologically isn't just that I have hatred of the other. I'm also denying that I have hatred of the other combined with the desire to exploit and use the other.
I understand. I think what's often in the way, in this collective way, and this is something you just mentioned, there's a lot of mythology that is used to help in that denial. So like, I think a lot of the otherers I just maybe made that word up, but a lot of the otherers they don't even have to grapple with themselves because the mythos it allows them not to. So one of the things I work on, right, Ida B. Wells, during in her book in 1895, The Red Record, when she's trying to make sense of the just brutal destruction of black men, women, and children. She, in the first chapter, she sort of works through the system of rationality that's at the root of lynching. And she says it goes through 3 phases. And so really fast, the first phase was the whisper of Negro insurrection. And so then in order to stop that, people justify going into cities and towns and destroying as many black lives as possible because there was whispers of an insurrection. So the point that she makes is really interesting is that there's a rhythm. An excuse would come and then no evidence for the excuse would follow, and so a new excuse was needed, right? So then the second excuse was we don't want to be dominated by black people. This is during the Reconstruction era. And so like as the ballot was being utilized and political positions were being obtained, this idea that this is a white man's government, her words, are just like, that was the next rationale. Then once Reconstruction was all but destroyed, like in its effect, there was a new excuse that was needed. And she says the excuse that was needed was the introduction of the myth of the black male rapist. And she says that's the most effective. Yeah. And part of why it was the most effective is because it's less concrete than the other two. Like they're always all around. Like allegedly, like
like Trump saying that the immigrants.
No. So what I'm saying, when you say this, that the self, this inability to misidentify, and Ida B. Wells dies in 1930. So like I think there have been more excuses that have been built on top, but that sort of rhythm between excuse and like rationale, I think that's what keeps the self from even having to deal with who they really are. And the excuses they preempt any introspection, and you can continue to other because you have good reasons to other, and then you can hide behind those
But
reasons.
yes, the other is desire. And owning that desire is really challenging. People don't want to, the desire to be with.
Oh, okay, well, there's both, the desire to rape, that is disowned, and the desire to be
The desire
with,
to
both.
rape, the desire to have,
Yeah,
the desire to be like, look at, they go tanning and they want to get as dark as me, and then, but it's about desire too.
yeah.
Well, those desires you're
And that desire internally is also hated, that they have that desire. Once you start probing and peeling that onion,
Right,
it comes out.
well, that can
And gets projected into that
Exactly.
rape kind of claim, you mean?
Exactly.
Okay.
Can I just build on this point? I want to expand it past America because I think it's a really, really
The what?
good, past the American story, right? That my argument is that the second wave of globalization, which starts with the conquest of the New World, but really kicks up, in the 19th century, where the West goes out to dominate the world, makes for ultimately a crisis where you have to name what's happening. And so xenophobia becomes the name. Racial science is a very specific name about races. It doesn't cover certain things, but that's a good one too. And then, that is got layers of mythology in each place. So there's layers of mythology about the Chinese. There's layers of mythology about the Arabs. There's layers of mythology about, and the classic cases are the Arab world, Mississippi, and the Asian world. And those are like every test case. So, and there is a way that, and you see the exploitative option of going to India as a person who hasn't made any money and has nothing really happening in the British Isles and becoming a minor king. There is the exploitative option. So exploitation, to your point, becomes a crisis because at some point, liberals and socialists start to realize how monstrous this is. When you have the Free Congo, a genocide of 10 million people, people start to wake up.
They wake up to a point. Here's what I think happens, right? Okay, I had an interesting conversation.
He said start to
I
work.
have an interesting anecdote. My son asked me fairly recently, he said, well, if you were born in the South, do you think you'd be a slaveholder? And I said, oh my God. Well, I mean, that kind of boggles the mind. I can't really imagine being another person, et cetera. But then it got me thinking. And I thought, what if I was born into a family of slaveholders? And all of my interests were around that institution. In order to feel good about myself, in order to have integrity, I would have to really believe a myth of white superiority.
Yes.
Sure.
I would have to believe it.
And that would support your wealth.
And that
If
would
you
support
had
my
400
wealth. So there
slaves-
is the exploitative aspect of it, but there's also the mythos
Yeah.
that I think comes into play. And I think that mythos ends up becoming the more important aspect. And I think little by little, it enters into all of our storylines about the culture. And we no longer, we can say, oh yeah, I don't believe that, everybody's equal, right? But we still have all the stories, and it's still in our bloodstream in a way.
Yep.
And that,
Yeah, and I don't know what to do about this, but you started us here, like, by pointing to the Declaration of
What did I do?
Independence. No, by pointing us to the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Right, like, at that moment when that is being penned, this brutal institution of enslavement it's happening, and one of the primary participants is the individual penning this very document.
Yeah. Yeah.
Built into the framework is this mythological tension where already one is trying to, these very lofty ideals about who the we are. I mean, it was clear to him, he doesn't write it even in a footnote, but it's clear to him who the we is not, right? And so like I think if
There wasn't women either, you know.
no, sure. I didn't say who not was the we, but the we know he knew who the we wasn't, right? And so he knows who he means. And so like built into the fabric of this is this sort of attempt to justify one's position. And I don't know what we do with like the guilt that seems to suggest, but like we see that at play. And it just seems like the unfolding since then has been this long story of, well, we're not really that bad because, or, but if they wouldn't have done, and this long story of justification.
Yeah.
When I was a kid in fourth grade in Washington, D.C., they started integrating the schools because of Brown versus State of Kansas. And so what happened was that one day we come to school, and the kids in the playground, in my white school, are talking about how the kids from the black schools are going to come over and beat us up.
Oh, Lord.
Now, I have been raised to be as anti-racist as you could be raised to be as a white person in Washington, D.C. at that time. And I was part of a community that was, supposedly anti-racist. And I had black friends when I went to the school before I went to this public school, right? And I didn't think anything about it. And I actually found myself getting scared and thinking, what if this were true? And it was one of those weird experiences of being totally split in the way that you're talking about, AL, where something is entering into you culturally at the same time that
Permeation.
it's...
Cultural permeation, again, we're back.
Exactly. But so I go home and I go to my mother. She's in her office, and I with my friends, and we tell her about this, and she says, like, what are you talking about? And she reminds me that of the little kids that I play with, Charles and Raymond and so forth, and I kind of get myself back together again, and I feel this terrible shame, like, how could I think this? I not only have a relationship with Charles and Raymond, I have a relationship with their parents. And it's true that they work there along with my mother, but, I'm driving around with their dad in the Jeep all the time, and here I am thinking this. So this is the most shameful experience practically, of that early part of my life. And you feel as though you are being interpolated. So when you see how that happens, you see, like I knew these other kids, by the way. I knew actually who they were and that they were very different from me, and very much not getting that message from their parents that I got. So then what happens, I think, is you become this unwilling conscript, this purveyor of something that you feel is alienating you from yourself. You don't recognize yourself as the person you thought you were. And so talking about guilt and shame, I think that's been, in my experience, subsequent, being in the civil rights movement, watching how white people reacted. What did I see? I saw, adult versions of this, and I saw people feeling tremendous guilt and shame around othering and not being able to talk about the fact that this is something that inevitably goes on in a society like ours, and that divesting ourselves from that is, sure, it's a moral obligation, but you can't be moralizing about it. So most of my work has this subtext about how do we get beyond moralizing around this, right? And I think the biggest problem is, in many ways, as I said, the thing you have to acknowledge about the self. It's not really the thing about the other. It's what you have, it's what you're saying about the self, at yourself. Who am I? And acknowledging hatred, but also acknowledging that desire, as you say, that whole ambiguity.
But are we saying that othering is kind of an instinct that lives between individuals and societies and organizes?
But I don't think this was just othering. I think this had to do with the idea that also it wasn't just that they were other. Remember that it was exactly what Jasper was talking about. It's what just makes me want to cry. What Ida Wells was talking about. She's talking about the fact that people rationalize something that is so horrible, and then you as a child are not necessarily fully on board with this, even if you don't have parents like mine. Like, I watched this ex-Nazi who I was tutoring English to in Germany. I watched him when his 9-year-old son came in and said he'd learned about the genocide of the Indians. Not that he used that word, God forbid, right? Because Dad was in the Navy during World War II, German Navy, and tried to pretend he had never been a Nazi. But anyway, Dad, what about the Indians? What do people do to the Indians? Dad gets all flummoxed. His 9-year-old knows this is not right. So there's something about how we are really internally destroyed in some way in our own sense of self by this, that I feel also has to be brought out.
But I think we can distinguish between that child, for instance, let's just pretend, and the capacity to use education to break down a rationalization, right? I mean, in a way, the post-war effort in Hollywood and in the curriculums has been an attempt to say, we can cognitively win this battle. We can actually teach people about what happened with genocide, what happened with slavery, and we'll change the way they think. And I think that's been pretty successful in some ways. The tougher problem is the people who want to hate. They don't care about your DEI lessons. They won't go. They're not interested. They are deeply committed. So I think we have to distinguish the little, the children who can, watch Birth of a Nation and ask their parents about it and then realize that's a crazy racist film, and the people who like it.
Yeah, but if you had been around when I was, you'd have seen that people who were critical and had the cognitive change still felt overcome and overwhelmed by the moral responsibility and by the fact that they didn't know how they were going to process that emotionally. And that is a really big problem for people today, because I don't think we're just dealing with the people who want to hate or learn to be bullies. I think part of the distortion that we're experiencing in our society right now is people who are trying to be good.
But do you think there are people who want to hate?
Yeah. You know what Adorno said? He said they fall in hate. It's a great phrase. Like the way we fall in love, that's it now.
But where are they
No,
starting
they're
from?
seduced into hate.
Yeah.
Well, that too. I think we're talking about many different things, so we can get confused. But that too.
Maybe they're in a state of fear. You see,
Yeah,
I think
that sounds, or a
fear
non-belonging? I mean, because I think.
I mean, this is the thing. We can make a long laundry list of what they are. We have to try to think.
Laundry list. I was arguing
I'm thinking of it in terms
psychoanalytically
of
that
lynching,
fear precedes
and what you
hate.
talked about in your
I agree.
in your book and your book on lynching, and Ida Wells.
Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells, sorry.
She's all are. She's one of the founders of my sorority.
Oh, really?
Oh, really?
Yes.
Ida B. Wells.
What does the B
Many
stand for?
apologies.
I'm sorry, I abbreviated it. It
What's
was-
the B, actually?
In any event, okay.
I don't remember what the
But-
B is, but it's Ida
But I
B.
think
Wells.
that the people that hate, the 5-year-old that talk to you that way, I think they are performing superiority. I think it's a way to,
Be over
it
the
enacts
other.
it.
And I think that performance has a function, right? So Fanon is talking about this little kid on the train. I mentioned a little kid that I had that interaction with. Ida B. Wells mentions a little kid where coming from a lynching, I think they were 8 years old, a little girl, 8 years old, and she was like, "Hey, mommy, we lynched that N-word last night, didn't we?" So what do these kids have in common? I don't think it's much different than the officer who murdered Mike Brown, and when asked why he did it, oh, he was swelling up and his eyes turned red, and he this demon language, and the officer who shot Laquan McDonald, I think they're channeling the same thing that children are channeling, and it seems to me, this is a suspicion, that their identity is deeply rooted in that hate. I need to, in order to belong, that is a group that I want to join in hating. I need to fit in here. Oh, we don't like them. Oh, they're monsters. Oh, they're demons. Okay, I'm gonna buy in and espouse that narrative so that I can be a part of the community. It may actually be rooted in this longing that we all have to be a part be a member in a group. And if this is the terms to be if this is the terms of membership, then I will apply. And then when I'm confronted with the shame of feeling these ways, I will narrativize my way out of it. Oh, my grandfather, my uncle, right? I'll find a way out. And even that escape hatch is rooted in identity formation, it seems.
Interestingly enough, there's been some studies about split brain patients where they can sort of give one image, like a naked person, to the right brain where the brains are split, and the left hemisphere will make up a story about what's going on that has nothing to do with the reality. Well, I think that happens emotionally. If you're in a state of rage and hate, then you put together a story of superiority, or you put together a myth. And that myth enters into the culture and sinks down into us. It sediments into us, I think.
So the problem is the condition, perhaps, condition of belonging. And then when there are certain conditions of belonging, then we all have to succumb to them. We all have to accept them if we want to belong. Right. So I really keep thinking it's more in how collectives are organized and what are the conditions that they put on us to be part of them that hate becomes a feature. I don't know if individuals want to hate, but I think individual wants to belong, and then belonging requires hate.
They fear ostracism if they don't perform the hate and the
That's right.
superiority, and I think, but I think then there's this next step, which was that when, for instance, with the Germans, when they heard that the Russians were coming. Now the Russians were in fact quite violent with the Germans, but at the same time, even before they got there and were violent, the Germans were telling these stories about what the Russians were going to do to them, which was, of course, what the Germans did to the Russians, right? I mean, so this is a big thing in the post-World War II discussion there. I think that projective back and forth, that do or done to relation that you get hooked into, once you're in that relation to another group or to another entity, let's say, you keep swinging back and forth. You might be thinking one moment, I did this to them, but then I did it because they did it to me, and so on and so forth. So the real thing is that what you can't get out of is the idea that somebody's going to have to do something to somebody, because we live in a world of doer and done to, and you're raised in this world of doer and done to where there's no else that you do.
Right.
It's always about power.
Right.
So to a large extent, what happens, I think, for people who started out in that exploitative world is they're in that do or done to world. They believe they're making an exception for their personal life, although they usually aren't. And then as a result, there's no other possibility than that those who we are oppressing are going to reverse the relationship and do it to us. There's no other possibility than that the enslaved people will rise up and they will kill us and they will do to us. And I think that that has to do, we really, that is a collective mentality. It's not, I mean, it exists in individuals as well, but I think it becomes a collective mentality. People in the Israeli people are functioning, for instance, in this belief that there is nothing else to do, because if they don't do this, the Arabs will come and do it back to them. And there's no possibility for them to acknowledge or even perceive when somebody comes to them in peace. They don't believe it.
Mm-hmm. Can I bring, you keep bringing up this point, and I think it's worth developing a little bit. So what constitutes different kinds of communities, right? And you're saying that it's important to think about what I call the border conditions, like what's in and what's out. Everyone has those. How porous are they? How rigid are they? How are they constructed? They can be constructed in relatively less or, more or less to what Carl Schmitt said, the German theorist, hate the people who are outside, or just really think of them as different. And then how unbelievably demanding is it once you get inside the collective? Right, so there are ways of thinking about the border conditions and then how restrictive the conditions are inside the community. And the reason I feel like I know about this is because I studied psychoanalysis. And the history of psychoanalysis is a beautiful little forum to understand how different communities build themselves around these things and then get broken because of hatred. But that's why I want to say, this is a dangerous thing I'm about to say here, but I want to say something for the Declaration of Independence.
So you look at me, right?
Well, you brought it up. You brought it up. And I want to say that there is something about that double consciousness of Thomas Jefferson, and then Ben Franklin edited that line, So them going like, this is who we think we are. And then everyone going like, what are you talking about? That's not who... That still is the fantasy. It creates a myth. Let's talk about myths that are not just negative, of that's who we are, which maybe has a virtuous effect, which is then everyone goes like, wait a minute, what about women? What about the people who are enslaved? And so, when I have this problem when I talk about like John Locke and tolerance and stuff like that, and people say, well, John Locke, owned shares in a slave state. I'm like, yes, he did. And that's why we also have to say that. But we also have to say that putting forward a model of a community that's tolerant was incredibly critical, because that was an ideal that he couldn't manage. He wanted to be tolerant to almost nobody. Catholics were out, Quakers were out, black people were definitely out. But he said his double consciousness in this case was, no, I'm tolerant. I'm not going to do this intersectarian war between Christians. We accept everybody except those, and those. And that then becomes a thing. Mm-hmm. It becomes not just like a theory, but a myth. And then people start to go like, but wait, what about the Quakers? Well, what about the... And I feel like that's the way history moves, and that if you, try to think about those things, it gives you a little bit more hope that incremental steps that, even though they're ironic, like Freud and women, like he couldn't do it. But, he took some steps, and then people take the ball from there. And that's, I think, how, one can maintain a progressive belief in history despite all of the horrors.
Okay, so I just want to piggyback on that, the dangerous thing you just said. I want to preface this pushback with what you said was beautiful. I love, however, but I don't know the word. I'm not negating.
Yes,
and. What is interesting to me is that I sometimes suspect that that aspiration, that fantasy, is a way to hide very brutal behavior.
I agree.
Right? So like I'm gonna put it's pure myth. I don't
It's
I don't-
ideology,
I don't,
we
yeah,
say. It's
yeah,
just
right.
ideology.
Let's dig on a pig.
And the reason
Don't forget that they were trying to rationalize why they're getting rid of the king.
no, so but the,
Remember, they did have that other thing they
Y'all,
were
here's
doing.
one, unfortunately, this is still critical discussion, but I think we're getting a signal that we're going to have to wrap it up, unfortunately.
Already?
Yeah, time flies.
This was like last night.
Oh, no.
I was just gonna say, like, along,
Yeah, finish, maybe you can
these
talk.
individuals have been pushed in concrete reality. One of the things that's really interesting, you know, the black thinkers that I study, they're constantly holding up the Declaration of Independence. Like, didn't you say this? Didn't you say this? Didn't you say this? And it's not met with, oh, yeah, I did say. That's not the reaction. It's often violence and oppression and further, like, beating down.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if sometimes the aspiration is a way of hiding. It's another way of hiding.
Yeah.
I hate to end on that dark note.
I think it's a validly dark.
It's
true.
Right in the beginning. It was the statement in the beginning was right, which is, who did they mean by we? They only meant themselves, and they only were trying to justify their own political revolution. The only mitigating thing I could say about that, which I think we should actually bear in mind, is that going against absolute monarchy required a certain kind of courage. So some of the people who were willing to go against absolute monarchy, the people around Tom Paine and the people back in England, like, for instance, Mary Wollstonecraft, who were affected by this, and then writes the Declaration of the Rights of Women. The fact is that attacking absolute monarchy was a prerequisite for even beginning to attack the idea that there was infinite exploitation was permitted. So it is ambiguous.
So let's stop there, and we're going to have a little time for a question from the audience. How does,
We depressed you?
do we pass a micro? Ed, I think you walk up to that microphone if you have a question for us. Or-
Early on, I had this question. In my experience, I worked at a helping profession. And you know what? There were a few haters there. Not racial haters, but haters.
Talking to the
that I
mic a little bit
worked with.
more, a little bit.
But I think it benefited me. And it happened, you know, after another kind of profession that I had. Here, the only explicit reference to improving things, in other words, maybe more like the family where I grew up in, where, you know, it was all of a particular ethnology, right? My children have an ethnology, not in every case, but, you know, they're married to someone who's different, right? Well, when I went to school, I, you know, had an interest and made friends and, you know, girlfriends and things like that, right? Who were very different. My parents never brought up any of that. But one thing was mentioned that was explicit. You mentioned about, I have a difficulty with memory. The Quakers. And that is the one specific, you know, mention of, you know, helping people get on the right side.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of disappointed with that. It was very good about the problem.
Yeah.
It's the solution
Yeah.
that interests me, that I give greater value to.
I just have one tiny, maybe it sounds cynical, but I appreciate that. It's I felt as well. Part of me would like to extend the conversation in exactly that direction. I anecdotally have, I guess, information about one of the Quaker schools and the frustration within their community about the capitalization and the sense that they are no longer being able to sustain even the Quaker Friends type of egalitarian ethos, and it's an open wound for even that community that they can't fight against the competitive exploitative, if you will, meritocratic kind of ladderization of even their community.
But can I add to that? I'm sorry if it didn't come through, so let me say what I think are actually really important points. Over the last half century, there have been a lot of victories, and they've come about very consciously about how to move more people into the center through a more porous boundary in our community. And one of those is desegregation. That's what desegregation has, a psychological quality to it. If you're afraid, habituate. It's behaviorism, basically. Put those people together, and does that work? Yes, it works for a substantial part of the population. The cognitive aspect, we're not making Birth of the Nation so much anymore, right? You can criticize what we're fed in our cultural diet, and now there's a whole nother ecosystem that's really, really racist. But you could say for the past 50 years, it's been a project of considering the other as us, right? And how successful it's been, we can all agree it hasn't been totally successful, obviously. But these are efforts that have huge amounts of value and that we all should remember as they're under attack.
And do we consider the value in terms also that people feel less exploited, right? Because that would be, again, at issue. Is it a more egalitarian direction that we're picking up with the sense that the norms of what you can say or can't say, or a movie you can and can't make?
See,
That seems to be a place.
interesting. We're not making Birth of a Nation anymore, but we're making Driving Miss Daisy. We're making Crash. We're making Green Book. So I wonder if So I wonder if the thing that we're making is this grappling with what it meant, and like this fight over whether or not we're gonna be like the most honest about who we are. Like that seems to be what's lining up the best pictures of like the last 20 years or so.
We're also, we're talking about, okay, sorry.
Oh, no. Yeah, maybe.
Well, I mean, we're also talking about mainstream media, and there's been a big shift into digital culture. And I think digital culture is a sea change. And it has been a racialized sea change. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one is when we talk in a conversation, we're talking about various things, but we're also talking to each other, and there's the text and the subtext. We're managing the relationship underneath it all. When we're online, we're anonymous and we're asynchronous. And so we have the illusion that we're just presenting an idea or ourselves, but in truth, we still are people who want to connect, and we do that in a different way, I think. We do that by signaling our belonging to a group, right? When I read a tweet, I'm always thinking, oh, what is this person really signaling beneath that? That's sort of an inevitable part of it. There's a second aspect, too, which I think is maybe even more important. There's this illusion that digital culture is radically democratic. But beneath the curtain, it's oligarchic and technocratic under the hood. And these algorithms, what they do is they absorb our preferences and feed them back to us.
Slightly more extreme.
So it's like we don't get the feedback that brings about a moral third, as Jessica puts it. What we do is we have an identificatory hall of mirrors where these identifications are consolidated and angry.
You want to step up to the mic?
I have an anecdote. Years ago, I researched a book in Haiti. And Haiti, as you likely know, is the only successful slavery revolt in human history. And I've worked internationally, and I've also worked in Israel, but Haiti is the most racist country I have ever been in. There are 48 different kinds of black and white color mix. Everybody knows what they are. And I had an experience. I shared a house in the Capitol with a woman who was doing her dissertation research in anthropology, and a white New Yorker. And in her research village, there was a child, an infant, dying of advanced tuberculosis. And Wilma adopted this child, gave it proper medical care. And it's being raised, Tisa was being raised in the Capitol. as an upper class child with an educated woman, mother. And, English lessons on Saturday mornings, the best kindergarten in the capital. And I took Tissé to a birthday party. And they were 3-year-olds. And this little boy came up to her and said, "I cannot marry you because you are too black." And this has stayed with me for decades, how profoundly, deeply rooted this was, because she was a peasant origin child, very dark-skinned. And so I throw that out. I have no solutions.
My students coming up. Go ahead. I don't think Haiti's the only racist. I mean,
Hell no.
we have that, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
You can stand up so we have a line of people.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You can go first.
Well, first of all, I think what we were referencing was colorism. That's how deep racism is. Like, it's often conflated with, oh, I can't believe other black folks don't like other black folks. It comes from an origin of racism and white supremacy. But I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing here with this conversation is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but talking about white fragility, that is going to be the deficit, or that's going to be the end of all. If we can't have honest conversations and say nigger, say words that actually we have to deal with on a basis, or just, romanticize, oh, well, we'll get along one day. All lives matter. We don't believe that. And honestly, the people that, that we're talking about don't believe that. And those people are defining my position as a black woman. So we're talking about othering. Look at me. I'm a black woman with locks. I'm a black woman that cusses. I'm a black woman that doesn't have children. I'm a black woman that probably, from a white fragilist standpoint, probably is not going to be your best friend, because it's everything that's not aligning to how I need to act. So for me as a black woman, no, I don't have the empathy or the patience for anybody, and particularly those that are in power that are just like, oh, it's all right. You should be okay with being dehumanized. You should be okay with, being questioned, or more importantly, you should be okay with just what's going on, because it's been happening for years and years and years, and all about. We just got to move forward. But as a social worker, I would say that, especially if you call yourself an ally, it's not just about these conversations. It's about actions. It's about checking the people with the MAGA hats. It's about checking the people that deny applications because this looks too black, or this is in what we're talking about others. This the other notion. So just like to say that, yeah, allyship comes with action. It goes beyond conversation. So very nice to know that everybody's on the same page, but nice to know outside of the building, So that's what I would like to say.
Thank you.
Anybody want?
Well, what kind of action?
Oh, I got a list for you.
All right. Send me the link. Now,
We need Sojourner Truth.
okay.
Some what? Sorry?
Sojourner Truth.
I think.
I
are you
attend
ready?
infrequently to these conversations, and this has been the most exciting one so far. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's
Great.
good.
I appreciate the conversation. Thank you. And yes, I agree that action is required, but I think reflection is also required prior to action, and not just reflection of how others other, but how I other. And I think it's valuable to look at these nefarious circles, but I think what's invaluable is to how that same dynamics operate in innocuous circles. I'm a sports fan. Scapegoating, projection occurs there. My sister loves fashion. Scapegoating, projection occurs there. So I think we need to look at how history has, there's plenty of evidence how it's been expressed, but how it happens within my own narrative, within how I other my brother, how I other my neighbor, I'm a Mets fan, how I other Yankee fans. So there's a lot of reflection before action. I think action can be quite dangerous if we don't reflect. I think there's a tendency, at least I perceive this conversation, you guys were very effective to others. I think I heard no one say about how I other.
I just had
Thank you.
a quick thought for a second. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I love that point, and I think it was a critical. There's this critical moment. I was researching xenophobia, and what I discovered was that xenophobia was used initially as a xenophobic concept. It was about inferior third world people, right, who were so immature along the evolutionary scale that they didn't understand that strangers were not all enemies. How did it flip to exactly what you're talking about, a way for the colonizers to actually develop a moral compass about their own action? It required two different stances that help people wrestle with this. And one is liberal tolerance, and the other is socialist brotherhood. That both of those said, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Mm-hmm. And that's where you see the debate starting to go flip, where they start to say, wait, maybe we're the xenophobes, not them. Mm-hmm. Look what we're doing. Look at what the Brothers League is doing in the East End. Look what happens in Mississippi. Maybe it's us. I think that's why I want to defend something like tolerance and this notion of socialist brotherhood as critical ways of getting some resistance to the bias that you're otherwise easily, and I'm really glad that you are a Mets fan. I'm a Yankees fan, but I love you, man. I just want to say that.
I will just add one quick thing. So one of the things that the paper that Dr. Gallagher and I wrote together, it emerged out of a frustration. He sort of had the offer, but where I came to the table is I was frustrated in graduate school. I took this metaphysics of race class, and we hit the implicit bias unit or whatever, and it was at the end of it like sort of the grand conclusion was like, yeah, we all have them, so we all had to take the implicit attitude test, the implicit attitude test, and so like, and then the grand revelation was like, oh, you have them too. All right, fine, but to treat all biases as like they don't all have the same historical effect. And I think it is critical to understand the part of the reflection is understanding that one, all biases aren't created equal. If I have a bias toward cat lovers, that we're not talking like that's not what I was talking about in that paper, and I'm not like, so to not conflate those, and to also understand that the biases that caused Laquan McDonald's life to be taken prematurely are heavier in the society as structured than maybe the ones I have toward male men or whatever, you know what I mean? So like that, I think it's important to understand, to weight them and to have the courage to look at them historically, not ahistorically. And if we look at them historically, they're not all weighted equal.
Well, maybe the term bias was invented as in order to obfuscate the basic facts of racism and other forms of, othering. You see, I think I would argue that positivist social science in America had developed many, many forms of obfuscation and just hitting just a little to the side of really the core of the problem.
So now here's my dangerous thing. The point I was making is that I think if you're part of a sharecropping family at a certain point in Mississippi, in a certain point in America's history, some othering may be self-protective. And it's worth understanding that, right? No, so I'm saying, so like when we even to just treat it as like othering, some othering was for like saved lives, where where others otherings endangered those said lives.
Let me
there's a danger in universalizing othering.
Right.
Yes.
Maybe let's make one last point, just to float back to some of this. But in some meta sense, like, are we saying maybe if we're going to belong in a more egalitarian society, we need to have a sense of hating in egalitarianism? You see, that would be the other. We don't really necessarily have a shared other in the nurture and parent family culture that George Lakoff describes. So we have a lot of reason to notice our differences, but why do we need to do things together toward a shared goal is less clear and less easy than they have it over on the right. I think we see that now. We just saw that unfold, but I'm not going to get into politics. But yes, you want to?
But there's a
Oh,
reason that unfolded. And if we don't get into understanding the roots of hating, then we're going to be missing.
Yeah,
think
that's why I
it's-
was being a
think
little
it's-
perverse in
My
saying.
sense is that it's helpful to understand the very particular roots of very particular othering. To understand the roots of anti-Semitism in Germany, for example, and the roots of anti-black racism in slavery.
This gentleman's been standing there for a while, so I just
Okay,
wanna make
sorry.
sure you get a chance.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a lot of energy in this roundtable to speak, which seems to me a very positive thing, and I thank you for it. From the moment that, Janice, you began with "We the People,"
Yes.
I found myself thinking about the Declaration of Independence in a way I really hadn't before. That "We the People" is a kind of cover story, a cover story that ignited perhaps one of the first moves toward building an American empire, which I think is now in a state of collapse. And I really hate living during the decline of empire because
Totally sucks.
You didn't like
So
the whole
lame.
Euro thing either, right?
But I mean that sarcastically because there's been a series of movements beginning in the 60s, which was when I came of age and started marching and sitting in and things. There's been just a series of one movement after another that are undoing the American empire, and it seems to me clear that the whole "Make America Great Again" is an attempt to go back to that empire under the regime of white supremacy. And it's a throwback, and maybe it won't last. Who knows? Maybe it will after this last election. But what I really want to say was there are an awful lot of false we's I started thinking about. There, the royal we, for example, the Siamese we, that if you cut Siamese twins apart, they bleed to death, which is kind of a we of confluence, of sameness. And that it seems to me that we is perhaps, of all adult developmental stages, creating a we is one of the most difficult. Whether we're talking about a marriage, intimate relationship, or a collective, a group.
Nice.
And it's basically, I think of it as an aesthetic project. Otto Rank and John Dewey both taught us that making your world and being in your world in every day is either a good aesthetic project or a bad one, good art or bad art. And so, what kind of art do you want to have from a we? You could have a Gregorian chant where everything moves in octaves and fifths parallel in the same way, or you could have a Bach fugue where there are different voices that preserve their difference and move toward and away from each other. And of course, I vote for that. And a last thing, I think that making a good art of we involves two things that seem to me extremely important: curiosity and empathy. But and I think of curiosity as the greatest ally of love, and empathy as, of course, something we're trained. I'm a practicing psychotherapist, that we're trained to do. But I just want to end this saying there also are problems about both curiosity and empathy. One is that curiosity is killed off in so many of us through our earliest socialization, like your example, Jasper, of the 5-year-old pointing and saying, "There's a Negro." Not with curiosity and openness and interest, but already taught something about this. This is a difference that we fear.
Right.
The problem is the arrow of curiosity and the arrow of anxiety, especially paranoid anxiety, go in opposite directions.
Yeah.
And finally, there's a problem about empathy, because, you know, you cannot get yourself in every other person's shoes. I ran across a book recently, quite lovely, by a writer named Aruna D'Souza, called Imperfect Solidarities. And she makes a big case for keeping opacity, not just empathy, but opacity, because some differences, some others are so different, you cannot really step in their shoes unless you begin to make them the same.
Yeah.
So to keep them other means keeping them opaque.
Yeah.
And she makes a case for caring that's much rather like Levinas's.
Yeah, this is Levinasian.
You
kind
know,
of, yeah.
the face of the other. Just seeing it, the living face of the other, means you have responsibility. And that's how Levinas gets to ethics before, as prior to ontology.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'll end there.
That's
But
beautiful.
you
Thank you.
know, in
We're gonna wrap.
Kohut's empathic attunement, he calls for us to be attuned. You know, we can't get in, but we can be attuned.
Yes.
I do like the idea of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Something about we, and I think that's, for me, that keeps being the challenge amongst the aesthetics and the empathy and tolerance and all that. René Girard spoke about it, and Freud definitely spoke about it in Civilization and Discontents. We is essentially violent. We exist in societies and in collectives in the condition that the collectives force upon us all kinds of things. And Freud talks about how this enforcement of rules, of norms, moves around, it gets inside, it goes outside, calls it a death drive at some point. But there's no gathering of people that does not become aggressive towards its own members to keep them in order, and therefore violent, at least in the margins, but always in principle in the center too. So it's always a circle of violence that's internal. And then how that gets worked out and how that gets often pushed outside through the phenomena of the scapegoat. For example, somebody spoke that you identify someone inside you and you kick them out, you make them other. I think that's the big problem of societies, that they are violent inherently. And can they not be violent? Can there be some kind of social regulation that is not aggressive? And if we assume it is, then how do we distribute in a different way? Because what we see now is that's it.
Okay, I think we're getting the signal. If there are no other questions, I think we're going to wrap up here. Want to say anything, or I mean,
Thank you very much.